Content warning. Some of you will find this talk offensive to your education, your religion, your thinking, and the world around you. I remind you that correlation is no evidence of causation. It is not the content that will offend you, but the realization that everything you once believed to be true is in fact a fabrication to simply enslave your body and soul to a demonic, tyrannical force that believes it has the right to decide how, where, why, and when you live and die. This content is presented to you all as my truth, a truth you can choose to accept or dispute, but should never be ignored or censored. It is your inalienable right to accept or reject my thinking and beliefs, but you should never control the right of others to freely think or question the evidence of facts. Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Life, the Universe, and Everything, a Perspective by Larry Cyprus, to be presented at New Horizons, St Anne's, on the 20th of May 2024. In this presentation, I will recall my journey of rediscovery that started 2 years ago with a visit to Berwick-upon-Tweed to study the city walls, a journey that revealed many truths hidden in plain sight. I will be bringing together many sources of information and showing how everything is interconnected in a giant jigsaw which appears to be a fractal of the entire universe. As my story unfolds, your mind will be truly expanded, and if your mind is not totally blown away, you should be left with a greater understanding of the reality of this universe and your surroundings. This is the first public presentation of my thoughts and brings together a number of theories and observations that you will have never seen associated together previously. There will probably be something new for everyone, but also many subjects you are familiar with, and hopefully I can demonstrate how all of these subjects are actually related and interconnected with each other. Everything covered here today is recalled in detail within my self-published works. The content of this talk will be available online after this talk on my Our Story and Albion Zodiac channels on some popular video streaming websites subject to their censorship. This presentation will call into question your education, taught history, and even the geology of the British Isles and the world as we understand it, along with many other concepts. Section 1. In the beginning. In 2021, I became a regular attendant of our local Stand in the Park group, where like-minded individuals meet every Sunday at 10 a.m. all around the world. We also held other meetings during the week. In June 2022, after many discussions with other members of our local group, I was invited to join a research group who were meeting in Berwick-upon-Tweed to look at the walls. The city walls of Berwick are in fact the remnants of a star fort, which I had been looking at for a number of months at that point, being guided by Sandy, a local member of the research group. I won't go into too much detail here, other than to say Sandy has been looking into the truth behind conspiracies for many years, if not decades. We have been taught that star forts or bastion forts were entirely defensive structures with impenetrable battlements and designs dating back to Leonardo da Vinci's earliest drawings. Or are these just detailed drawings attributed to this man? The entire narrative fell apart for me between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. on the first morning of our stay in Berwick. Why? Well, I woke early that morning after arriving late in the afternoon the previous day and spending the evening meeting and chatting with the other members of the group. As I was first up, and I didn't expect to be joined by them for a few hours, I set off for a walk around the walls alone. The construction of these walls was fascinating, far better than any city walls that I could recall, and the blocks were far larger than those of, say, York or Chester. In fact, as I think about it now, these blocks and their finish are more in keeping with the old world buildings, such as the grand city halls, as we might see in Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, or indeed any city around the world. But let me continue with my walk around the walls and my observations of that sunny June morning. As I wandered around the tops of these impressive walls, I couldn't help but wonder what was being hidden from us, as it was clear that these were not defensive walls, but an integral part of some vast mechanism of which its full workings still remains a mystery. But let's look at the evidence and see what we can work out for now. This is a LiDAR image of the walls taken from houseprices.io website, and I'm going to number the bastions clockwise 1 to 5 for ease of reference. I approach the wall from a path midway between Bastion 4, known as Windmill Bastion, and Bastion 5, known as King's Bastion. As I stood on the walls overlooking a children's playground, I saw the earthworks opposite the wall. Only once I observed these on the LiDAR system did they become clear, and these earthworks put me in mind of other star forts all around the world, and I'm going to add the outlines here so that you can see. We can compare these earthworks to the walls at Bern in Switzerland or the still standing walls in Valletta in Malta. Yet here in Berwick there is no mention of these walls other than a dismissal of these mounds as the remains of a previous standing fort or castle for which there is zero evidence other than the written history provided by the Masonic English heritage, who persist in pushing a false narrative that constantly contradicts the physical evidence all around us, which we have been programmed over many decades to ignore or dismiss as the mad rants of conspiracy theorists like myself. The footprint of this alleged fort only accounts for a very small section of this clearly extensive earthworks visible in these LiDAR images, which are now freely available online. As I slowly moved northwards on the wall, I approached Windmill Bastion, number 4 on this image, and noticed the rooms to the rear of the bastion. It was clearly a sluice room. The windows were where the water flowed out of and into the reservoir outside of the walls, and I deduced that the long-gone windmills were probably pumping water from either the sea or the River Tweed. The placement of these sluices at the rear of the pentagonal bastions would act like a venturi, introducing the fluid into the reservoir and causing a flow or even mix. Besides creating an even mix or allowing a constant flow, there are a number of other reasons why this could have been necessary, such as increasing oxygen saturation levels and reducing carbon dioxide levels, or stopping silting within the reservoir, and water may have also been pumped from within the reservoir itself. But until we have full access to such sites or a pristine site, then this understanding and knowledge remains theoretical to us, although I'm sure someone knows, or there is a fully documented understanding of this knowledge that has been withheld from us, that probably predates Leonardo da Vinci. Later, I will also reveal some interesting properties of water itself that potentially could mean that these star forts were the equivalent to power stations today, and I find it even more interesting that I realised over 2 years ago that virtually every power station in England, if not the world, appears to be standing on top of the remains of a star fort. But only in writing this presentation did I realise the significance of this observation. As I went on further to explore Bastion 3, it was clear there was a dividing wall between what would have been the east and north reservoirs, and if this was purely a defensive structure, then this wall seemed superfluous to the design. As I admired the visible construction, I saw an English Heritage disinformation board, and I went to read it. And I found myself uncontrollably laughing out loud at the false information that we had been given to explain these high sluice openings at the rear of the bastions. What was so funny? Well, the information board tells us that these hidden rooms at the rear of the bastions were to house hidden cannons, so that even if a marauding army had set to storm the impregnable defensive walls and got as far as the main wall, these cannons could be fired to take them out. In the sluice room of Bastion 2, there is a cannon set up to demonstrate this cock and bull story. But let's apply some simple childlike logic to this narrative. If you fired this size of cannon from this inset window, the only thing you could possibly hope to hit is the cannon opposite you in the next bastion. Furthermore, to this argument, these windows are lower than the top of the wall and thus a chink in the defensive structure. Why not simply place the cannon on the top of the wall rather than compromise the defensive and impregnable nature of the wall? The whole narrative just reeked of manure. Later on in 2022, I revisited my research on Berwick's walls and added a missing sixth bastion to my plan of the walls. This is because the external earthworks between bastions 4 and 5, as seen in other star forts, were never off-centre from the entire structure. So the lack of these structures between 3 and 4 and the symmetrical nature of other designs must mean that there's missing sections of the wall and another bastion at Berwick. It should also be noted here that many star forts and their satellite bastions, as well as having symmetrical designs, tend to have a semantic pattern to them, and this could possibly amplify frequencies out to the surrounding countryside, possibly to assist or encourage life and growth by extending the range of the frequencies being produced or amplified. It is interesting then that Berwick's satellite amplification seems to be directed away from the land, so we might say that this is either projecting the frequency eastward over or into the sea and beyond, or is it capturing a frequency from that direction? As so often is the case, my subconscious use of words seems to be intuitively ahead of my conscious thoughts, and these satellite bastions seem to become, as a satellite dish, a means of concentrating and directing outgoing or incoming frequencies not dissimilar to radio dishes are utilised today. And whilst we're on the subject of cymatic patterns and projections of frequencies, I feel there is a correlation between the shape of these bastions and the stonework within cymatic windows of churches, especially rose windows or large cathedrals, which seem to have interesting resonance chambers and some very large frequency generators in the form of pipe organs. And I now feel I need to start looking at the directions of these satellite bastion projections or receivers of frequencies, as well as the alignment between cathedral rose windows. But more on symmetrical and cymatic patterns later. There are a number of other anomalies in Berwick that are included in my first book and featured within my Starfort series of videos on my YouTube, Our Story channel. Section 2. A Question of Geography. In late November 2022, whilst continuing my journey of rediscovered knowledge, I was watching Paul Cook's presentations of the White Cliffs of Dover and how they appear to be man-made structures. Paul's presentations of geopolymer and other old world technology are extremely interesting. As I watched and listened to him, a question arose in my mind. If the cliffs are man-made, then there must be some sort of design to it, a plan of sorts, and not just a random erratic construction. And surely, with all our technology and available information, we must be able to see this design. I set about looking for myself, using online LiDAR and map sites. This wasn't going to be an easy task, because if it was, then surely someone else would have recognised the design by now, and we would all know about it. I posed this hypothesis in a video presentation and included images of other countries, noting Portugal was a westward-facing face, and France was a pentagon, and not a hexagon, as the French refer to it. I also showed my observations of Ireland being a Scotch terrier on its side, Cyprus, far from being the swordfish as depicted on my Bank of Cyprus debit card, appeared to be a raven, although it could just as easily be a conch shell. So what of England and Scotland? My initial thoughts were that it was Britannia, and once again we have to reverse the usual image that we have of Britannia facing to her left, and now face her to her right, or our left, as we view her. It's fascinating that many images are mirrored to hide their origins. After making this video presentation, and not convinced I was totally correct, but happy with the possibility of the origin of the depiction of Britannia, I was contacted by a viewer of my channel, and he forwarded a number of images from a book he had. The book is called Behold Jerusalem, written by Graham K. Griffiths and published in 2003. To say I was gobsmacked is an understatement. These images, I felt, were indeed the blueprint of not only Dover, but the entire landmass of England, Wales, and even Northern Ireland. These 13 images were the symbols of the zodiac, 13 because he had 2 for Gemini, and all came together to form each and every inch of the coastline from Middlesbrough to Dover, across to Land's End and back up to the Scottish border just north of Carlisle, and with a bonus of including Northern Ireland too. This was amazing, and I instantly found a second-hand copy online and ordered it. The author, Graham K. Griffiths, had seen 4 giants in the coastline of Britain as a child, and on visiting Glastonbury 30 years later, had seen the same giants once again within Catherine Maltwood's Glastonbury zodiac. This led him on a 10-year quest to find the remaining 8 giant symbols of the zodiac within the coastline of Britain. Graham even found their inland outlines of each of the symbols, defined by roads and rivers, and published in his 2003 book. Several months after obtaining this book, I was finally put in touch with Graham directly, and he still has a number of copies of his original book available. If you are interested in obtaining this amazing publication, please contact me via my email, albionzodiac@gmail.com, and I will forward your details to his daughter. Alternatively, you can email Holly directly at harpothebudgie@yahoo.com. I would highly recommend you obtain a copy yourself. After studying his book and its contents, I felt Graham's own brief fell short of my own. After all, Graham was only looking for the 12 symbols of the Glastonbury zodiac, although he actually found 13. So let me explain my observations here. Every symbol in Graham's zodiac defines part of the coastline, and where one symbol finishes, another symbol starts, which is all fine and dandy until you come to Northern Ireland. The rest of the coastline of Ireland is simply ignored by Graham, as he'd already found his 12 symbols from Glastonbury. So I set about looking for faces within the coastline of Ireland to see if I could identify them. But as I set about this task, I was asked where the 13th symbol of the zodiac was. Graham had indeed found 13 symbols, so I compared this landscape giant that had not appeared in Glastonbury to the missing 13th constellation, commonly thought to be that of Ophiuchus. I was amazed. The griffin that Graham had found matched the outline of the constellation of Ophiuchus. In modern representations of Ophiuchus, it is seen as the snake bearer. Later, I was told that I can't simply compare two outlines and say that it's a match, but that is surely what these symbols represent. To me, I needed no more justification to confirm its identity. But why 13 symbols and why only 12 now? There is currently a movement towards a 13 symbol zodiac rather than the traditional 12, as defined around 2000 years ago by Ptolemy, due to there being 13 lunar months. It's amazing that people do not understand that our ancestors were not, like we are taught, primitive cave-dwelling idiots, but in fact had observed and accurately recorded the movements of the heavens for probably around 400,000 years or more. It is impossible to have the knowledge we have today without such accurate observations being recorded over such a long period. Digging a little deeper, I found that publications that gave a horoscope reading for Ophiuchus often also included Cetus as a 14th house in the zodiac. So I looked up Cetus, as this would be the obvious starting point to assign at least part of the coastline of Ireland. And once again, gobsmacked doesn't come close enough to my feelings when I saw my Scottish Terrier, albeit with a fishy tail, sniffing at the Guinness. How apt. So, although not a little dog, we have a whale of a sea monster. So I looked up the myth around Cetus. In Greek mythology, Cetus, the kraken, is described as having two rear limbs, not a tail. I have no idea why this detail was included in the text of the myth, but for me this was most beautiful confirmation that Ireland was indeed, in its entirety, the single constellation of Cetus, the Kraken, with Northern Ireland, or Scorpio, curled up on its head. A few weeks later, and as with Graham's own findings of aptly placed place names, verbal confirmation came from a chance viewing of a video called The 5 Best Things About Ireland. I can't recall the first two, and I didn't see the last two, because as I watched and listened to the third best thing about Ireland, the narrator clearly said, or at least I heard the narrator say, it was the Craughan Cliffs. This set me in a frenzy. The cliffs in question are in County Mayo and are the second highest sea cliffs in Europe. The highest are those in the Faroe Islands, which is the territory of Denmark, and I'll be coming back to those islands in the future, I am sure, but not today. So, the Irish cliffs are actually called the Craughan Cliffs, which is Old Scandinavian or Norse, translates to crooked hand. In Norse mythology, we also find the mythical Kraken, presumably with his crooked hand, living in the sea between Scandinavia and Iceland. And where is the Craughan Cliffs? They are on the very crooked hand of Cetus, our Kraken. And I have to wonder if the myth has corrupted and Iceland is really Ireland, and the crooked hand referred to the rocks of the giant Cetus. and is the reason the Irish enjoy the crack in some way related to the knowledge that they live on the Cracken, or just because they're hooked on sniffing the Guinness? Now, all of this just left me with a little blob of land, other than Scotland, in the centre of the map. It had been playing on my mind for a while, and I was aware of its similarity to the most famous Christian painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Over the course of 2023, with all these zodiacal images in my face, I became interested in the landscape zodiacs, especially as the Glastonbury zodiac was simply a miniature reflection of the British Isles, and I had been watching and reading Hugh Evans' work, which covers astronomy and the Welsh language. Whilst in the middle of documenting this giant landscape zodiac and having identified the Isle of Man as the image on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, Hugh released a video on the Awen. Hugh's work explains the Welsh language and how words have true meaning rather than like English. We get told the word has its roots in Latin or European language, and then it just leaves it hanging without an explanation of its original meaning. Hugh's work also looks at the origin of the zodiac from a very interesting Welsh point of view. The Awen is the constellation of Cassiopeia, and in Hugh's Welsh astronomical star map, sits within the larger constellation of Don's Cauldron. Don is also known as Ceridwen, and so her cauldron was full of a broth of knowledge and inspiration. A young boy called Gwaenbach tasted a drop of the broth and gained all knowledge of the world before he was literally reborn as Taliesin and cast adrift in a coracle. Taliesin is also believed to be the wizard Merlin. Now, the meaning of Awen in Welsh comes out in a number of meanings or concepts such as inspiration or spark of life. So this is inside Ceridwen's cauldron, Don's cauldron. And if you're as old as me, you might remember the titles to the South Bank show, where we see the picture on the Sistine Chapel ceiling come to life and give Adam the elusive spark of life. And that spark of inspiration came to me. The image of God in his cloaked choir was that of Don's cauldron, and the Awen being the outstretched arm of God. Or is it a depiction of Taliesin, or Merlin, being cast out in a coracle? The image of God may be an interpretation of all-knowing wisdom that we might perceive as a wise old man. Or is the story of Taliesin a facsimile of a long-forgotten God story? Whichever way round it is, the depiction on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel has the same outline as the Isle of Man in the centre of this zodiacal landscape we know and love as the British Isles. I believe the Isle of Man is the constellation of Don's Cauldron, which might be viewed as Taliesin adrift in his coracle, or God in his cloaked choir of angels. Not so coincidentally, a cloaked choir can be expressed with a single Welsh word, coracle. The clincher for me that God in his coracle was the Isle of Man is the most awkward of outstretched hands of God. It's not pointing or passing on the spark of life. If anything, it's grasping to be saved. And Adam looks like he's just taken a snooze on the riverbank after a workout down the gym. Hardly lifeless, but let's look at the clinching hand in detail. Oops, sorry, that's the southern tip of the Isle of Man. But hang on, if I add a few lines here to draw your eye, do we not have that clinching hand of God? So why is God in his Welsh boat on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and why is that in the heart of the zodiac that is the British Isles? Well, let's just look at that ceiling again. Have we been fooled into thinking this is God in heaven? I'm not saying it's not a depiction of God, just that it's not in heaven. He is in fact sailing down a Welsh sacred river, the River Dee, and he is in a coracle, a cloaked choir. And this is also a human brain, as seen back in the 1990s by an American doctor. If God isn't bringing life or wisdom or inspiration to Adam, then is he grasping to be saved by Adam? And if Adam didn't catch him, where would he drift to? Straight out into the Irish Sea is where he'd drift to. Is it us that should be saving God, who appears to be living in the human brain? Should we indeed be feeding him with the inspiration of life and knowledge, as we are surely designed to do? Is true understanding and knowledge our path to saving God? And isn't Adam the mirror of that Gemini in the giant Albion zodiac, sat on the banks of the River Dee, which is the back of Taurus, which has an uncanny resemblance to that land in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as well? So now we see God resident in the human brain, receiving his Arwen through the mind's third eye, and he's adrift in the Irish Sea, which, if we imagine to be a physical, graphical representation of the Milky Way passing through the zodiac, it would actually be in the same direction of flow as it passes the constellation of Don's Cauldron within Hugh's Welsh celestial star map. To understand what's going on here with the British Isles and on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, we need to consider what the zodiac is and why Don's Cauldron is so important. Section 3. A question of religion. He was said to be the Son of God. He was conceived by Immaculate Conception, born on the 25th of December, known as the light of the world. He had 12 disciples. He died on a cross. He was dead for 3 days before he came back to life. Who? Well, you might be surprised to hear there have been at least 42 people that could fit that description, be that Jesus, Tammuz, Horus, or any of the others. However, none of them are the original child of God, the one who came to earth from heaven above, but more about him later. Let's talk about these 42 God-men first and their association with the zodiac. The physical existence of any one of these men actually living becomes questionable when you realize that all the above characteristics I just mentioned are actually talking about the Sun, S-U-N. All religion is in fact based upon the worship of the same single God in heaven, and we will come back to him later too. And yes, I do mean all religion. The Sun is reborn every 25th of December if you live between the equator and the North Pole. And you might be surprised to know that 90% of the world's population lives in that area. And if we look at the blue marble model of Earth, we see that around 70% of this globe is covered in water. Of the remaining 30% of surface area, 2/3 is between the equator and the North Pole. So we find 90% of the population lives on 20% of the surface area of the globe. So for 90% of the world's population's perspective, the sun travels lower in the sky each day from the summer solstice until the winter solstice on the 21st of December. It then appears to die because it stops getting lower or higher in the sky and has no noticeable movement until 3 days later on the dawn of the 25th of December, when it comes to life, thus born or reborn after 3 days of not moving or death, and starts to move progressively higher in the sky each day until the summer solstice. As for the cross, it might be assumed that the Southern Cross constellation, which is currently centered at the southern hemisphere celestial pole, is the cross that the sun dies on every 21st of December. On an incidental note, the observation of the Southern Cross constellation is more than enough evidence to dismiss any notion of a flat Earth, as is the geometry of the setting sun each day. More details can be found in my second book. There is an association with 40 as well. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. Tammuz died at the age of 40. And the sun has a 40-year cycle too. We are told that the 42 sons of God had followers or disciples, usually 12. And the sun has 12 followers too, the constellations of the zodiac. So they follow the path of the sun over the course of the year, or the sun follows the path of the constellations. But the zodiac is basically the constellations that the sun passes through following the line of the ecliptic. If we look to Jesus as the most familiar Son of God, to most of us, well, definitely me, the lead disciple is Peter. Peter, the fisherman or fishman who Jesus chose to build his church upon, according to the Catholic teaching. The White Pope of the Vatican, at least by the Catholic Church, is seen to be the chosen or ordained successor to St. Peter, and wears a fish head style mitre in his honour. The early symbols used by the followers of Peter, the fisher of men, was also a fish. This symbol is the intersection of two circles, and this intersection is still used today in many religious symbols. Indeed, the circle and the intersection of two circles is a very strong structure as well as a symbol of strength. In astrological terms, you might view Aries as the start of the zodiac. This is probably because the astrological symbol and dates were defined just over 2,000 years ago, when the dates corresponded to the sun being within those constellations on those dates approximately. However, over the course of an era lasting about 2,160 years, the sun rises in a different constellation on the spring equinox, and the constellation of Aries is not currently entered until about the 16th of April rather than the 21st of March, which means that the current leader of the zodiac on the spring equinox, which traditionally marks the start of the year, is in fact Pisces. So we are currently in the era or age of Pisces, which followed the era of Aries. And at some point in the next 150 years, we shall be entering the era of Aquarius, or the age of Aquarius, as made famous by Andrew Lloyd Webber. So it is not by chance that we have the most dominant religion, Christianity, using the fish as their religious symbol for the past 2,000 years, nor is it by chance that we are shown previous heathen religious leaders wearing ram's heads or skulls of ram headgear, or that Tammuz was known as the Lamb of God, although this seems to go hand in hand with other titles such as Light of the World. And the association back to the sun is illuminated once more. I suspect that the dominant religion of the next era will not be symbolised by a guy spilling his jug of water all over the place, but a return of the phoenix as it used to be before Ptolemy defined the zodiac symbols 2000 years ago. The phoenix is clearly seen in both Glastonbury zodiac and the zodiac landscape of the British Isles. It's the Lake District. And as I think about the symbolism and the blurring of when we might actually enter the next era, as there is an overlap of constellations, I am reminded of the emblem of Germany, allegedly taken from the Roman emblem, which seems to have its origins in a double-headed phoenix rather than an eagle. But this also appears in America too, but I guess no more sinister than when used by Barclays. Whoops, I meant Hitler's army. So it appears that far from the Catholic Church adopting pagan rituals and holidays, they have in fact just rebranded the previous main religion of the previous era and served us up with the worship of the sun and the stars, threatening nonconformists with being removed from the face of history or the planet in the 4th century CE or current era. Even the Bible appears to be an edited and updated version of the previous religious text. All text was allegedly held and transcribed by religious sects, which the Catholic Church would have had full control over. Systematic removal and control of all history has been going on for many years, decades, centuries, and possibly even millennia, although it is actually virtually impossible to be certain of any fact or timeline prior to 1850. And the more I learn, the less certain I become of our taught history. It's hard to prove anything that happened more than 75 years ago, or that we have first-hand living memory of. Second-hand information becomes less certain as we are reliant on relevant first-hand experiences being accurately passed on, and who knows what is relevant 150 years prior to a question being asked. It is very sad misconception that we are taught accurate historical facts. If I were to ask what evidence there was for a fort standing in Berwick-upon-Tweed, where I saw the earthworks outside the current city walls, I might be shown a written record or an illustration of such a fort, but I cannot ask for an eyewitness testimony given by a living person to confirm the accuracy of those records. And as we've all witnessed, especially 4 years ago, those that dispute or disagree with the official narrative are simply silenced or personally removed from history, as in taken out, Essex style. And for those of you old enough to remember, you can confirm the muffler or silencer on your car was once known as a baffle. And this word seems to be having a resurgence, as many has-been drips under pressure are silenced about current situations, or rather, experts are baffled. How many times have you heard an expert say recently they are baffled and unable to state the obvious cause? Should we understand this as they have been silenced and unable to state the obvious? Well, they do say they have to tell us in some sort of display of arrogance or contempt of our intelligence, or to move the consequence of other people's actions to the individual person rather than hold the responsibility themselves. I believe I am correct in saying that a French court ruled that the death of an individual that had received a medical intervention was the responsibility of the individual rather than the administrator, the producer, or anyone who had promoted the intervention, as the individual had been informed. It was up to them to protect their friends and family. Section 4. The Law of Life. This section might seem disconnected as I explain some concepts that will tie things together in an everything's connected way before the end of this presentation. The theory of an electric universe is growing in momentum. This theory potentially dismisses the accepted timeline of stars and planetary creation and a singular Big Bang theory. Currently, it is taught that the planets are formed around an already formed star in the disk of material surrounding it. In the electric universe model, the planets and stars are formed simultaneously, so the birth of the planet may happen prior to the illumination of the star. And isn't this how the creation story describes it? The Bible says that in the beginning was the Word, but let's consider what this means. The Word of God has been described as a clap of thunder, and if we think about this, we might imagine a great electrical storm and a flash of lightning to cause a tremendous release of energy, which in turn causes superheating of its surroundings, and this then causes the sound of thunder as the matter explodes with tremendous force. So let's imagine that there is a great buildup of static, and from this a discharge of energy as it jumps across the expanse to a lesser or oppositely charged area. This transfer of a vast amount of power might in itself cause a blinding flash and a superheating of the surroundings along a path of least resistance to balance the charge. And if we were to look at lightning, we would see it does not travel in a straight line, but constantly, or at least in the split second that we can see it, changes direction in order to correct this imbalance of charge between the atmosphere and the ground. With the suggested size and power of such a stream of power transfer that possibly brought the galaxy into existence, we must also consider the sound and its immense power to destruct, condense, and also create or alter matter in its path or wave. This may be what is referred to as the voice of God, a spark of life, or even the Awen, the inspiration of life. And if we are considering power and electrical charge, we must also consider magnetism. Surely such a tremendous ejaculation of power must literally cause an astronomical magnetic field. Although I don't currently think there was a single spark that created the entire universe, or even a single galaxy in a single instance, I'm always open to reconsider any reasonable argument for or against any situation. But if a tree falls in the forest and nobody is around to hear it, does it make a noise? The obvious answer to the question is yes, but it is not observed or heard. This brings me to a question of observation. Who observed or heard the Word of God? Again, this seemingly simple question opens a myriad of questions and proverbial rabbit holes for our minds to explore. Not least of all would be who created God and who observed the creation of himself. Does God exist as a conscious being or purely energy? Can energy have consciousness and thought? Can words be formed without thought? I know they can be spoken without consideration, but surely never without thought. Is God a subjective construct? And whose construct is it? Are we made in God's image, or God's image of us? Or do we imagine God in our image? I'm not here to answer any of these questions today, but these are just some of my thoughts that frequent my coracle, especially as I look at the world around me. But who am I and where am I? Well, I present myself today in front of you surrounded by my body. This body started life as a single cell, encoded with all the instructions for its design and workings. We are born with around 26,000 million cells, or 26 billion in American, all produced in the process of mitosis, where a cell splits to form an identical copy of itself. Therefore, we might reasonably assume that each cell within us is a fractal of our whole body. The code within our DNA is the assembly instructions for our body. All our organs, our bones, our blood vessels, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our skin, our brains, as well as our operating instructions. All of these instructions form just part of our DNA coding or biological memory. It has been shown in studies of people who receive transplants that some memories are passed from the donor. Maybe if we could learn to read our own genetic memories, we might find that we not only carry the genetic makeup of our ancestors, but their memories too. And we might find great comfort that our parents and grandparents truly do live on within our heads and hearts and bodies, as we will in our children and our grandchildren. Truly never to be forgotten. Maybe when we hear of people regressing under hypnosis, we might wonder how so many people could become Cleopatra or Julius Caesar, as we assume that their spirit has travelled forward to a single body in the future. If we tip this model on its head and say the spirit has passed within their bloodline, there is little wonder that so many people regress to a common ancestor within history. But maybe we are recalling the memories of our own ancestors held within our DNA. Although, having said that, some regression seems to take people back to someone who appears to be totally unrelated. So maybe we're recalling memories of their ancestor that recalls being with the famous person. Who knows? But back to me here in my body that didn't appear as a bundle of 26,000 million identical cells in a big blob on the floor, but as a fully formed tiny person, just like you did. But is that who we are? Or is that our body a biological vehicle for our consciousness or soul? Vehicle isn't the concise description, as it is far more than that. It's a mobile factory, able to convert the food we consume into energy and raw materials to repair and build and expand itself, filtering minerals to make bones and flesh accordingly. More than this, it moves under its own control and can detect objects, moisture, temperature, differences between frequencies of light and sound, and detect different minerals by taste and smell. With a combination of our five senses, we interpret the world around us. You are currently interpreting the sound I have learnt to produce to communicate. You have learnt to interpret my sound into meaningful thoughts despite never hearing these words in this order before. Let's just consider for a moment the process of what we are all participating in here. I felt I had some important information to pass on. I collated the information, then started typing a script of what I wanted to say, juggled it around until I felt it flowed in some sort of order, and the words flowed and conveyed my thoughts. I'm now reading back my own words to you with my own voice, which is probably distinct enough that you would recognize me in the future, even if you could only hear my voice. But what's happening at your end? You are hearing my voice, some of you for the first time, yet you hopefully understand every word I am saying, and it isn't just some random noise without meaning. Tomorrow, you might not remember every word I've spoken today, but hopefully you will retain some of the information I feel is important, and you may have a better understanding of the world around us, your place within life's rich tapestry, and you may even consider that I'm not just some mad nutter with equally mad theories. But who am I to stand here and tell you what to think? In the grand scheme of everything, I'm nobody, and I certainly don't have any right to tell you what or how to think or not think. However, I think everyone listening to these words I'm presenting, certainly those present in the room, have already proven they are free thinkers. I certainly have no more right than anyone else in this room to stand up and be heard. I'm just chose today to take a turn to stand at the front, and I look forward to seeing every single one of you take your turn here. You may think I'm just waffling on now, but there is a point, and that is, as I'm sure you are all aware, nobody has the right to tell you how to live and think, and nobody is more equal than you. We are all equal, all born from a single cell. All have a right to speak and think freely. Opinions and thoughts should never be censored, as long as we respect those around us and their rights to free thought. Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, unless you've got sadomasochistic intentions, in which case, keep your thoughts to yourself. So who am I? Who are you? Are we the vehicle, or are we the consciousness it carries? It seems hard to define one without the other. The boundaries appear blurred, or is it just the definition that is blurred? If we can store memories of love in our heart, or reasoning in our brain, can we indeed store memories of actions in our muscles? I'm sure the phrase muscle memory is not unfamiliar to you. So do we store interpretations of sound within the inner workings of our ear? The interpretation of touch in our fingers? Is our notion of beauty held within our optic nerve? After all, it is said beauty is held within the eye of the beholder. And if we look at how videos or images are produced and stored digitally, there is a lot of processing performed by the capture device, taking the large volume of information, then reducing it to minimize the amount of bandwidth or volume of data transmitted or stored. Our eyes do the exact same thing. They have image memory, or rather, they identify parts of the view as constant and concentrate on the moving or changing parts of the vision. I'm sure you've all tried staring at an image, then looking at a blank wall or a piece of paper only to see a negative image appear where there is obviously nothing to see. We are told to accept our five senses as the be-all and end-all, yet we know there are more. Last year, following the path laid out by my research, which often appears random and unconnected, a bit like this presentation appears, but stick with me, it all gets tied up together at the end, I hope. So, I was put in touch with a practicing druid, said to be the main druid in the UK today, although that's probably just a play on his name, Lawrence Main. I was able to spend a number of hours in his company at his home, and he took me on an impromptu tour of his local area, complete with dowsing rods. We even went to talk to a stone and had a conversation with a tree. Okay, now you're probably thinking I'm off my rocker, and I'm now a tree hugger and a rock whisperer. And as much as I would like to say I am, unfortunately, I am not yet attuned to that level. Okay, now you really do think I'm mad, but don't knock it until you've tried it. Lawrence Main actually runs the Lay Hunters newsletter, and it was whilst researching Graham K. Griffith's Behold Jerusalem work that Hugh Evans, the Origin of the Zodiac and the Origin of Numbers author, put me in touch with Lawrence as he had copies of articles about Graham's landscape zodiac. All of these three people are also friends with Gary Biltcliffe, Spine of Albion and other documented ley line books. And here's the point. Lawrence and Gary use dowsing rods to track ley lines. The detection of these lines is not performed by the rods, but by your own body. The rods are simply there as a visual reference to connect your subconscious to your conscious, I suppose. But it's not just ley lines that can be detected and identified by our bodies. We can search virtually anything. Many of you will have heard about water dowsing, but did you know they can be more accurate than a metal detector to find treasure or electrical cables? You can also dowse remotely using a map. The possibilities are as vast as your imagination, and yes, you can talk to plants and receive answers too. I recently attended a meeting of a local dowsing group that specifically discussed how to do this. They even created a dowsable line using paper cups. My point here being that our sensory perception goes far beyond touch, sight, smell, taste, and sound. And back when I was talking about the Sistine Chapel ceiling, I asked if we should be saving God in his coracle by feeding him the knowledge of our world around us through our senses, and if that coracle is indeed our head, is God resident in our mind? Is our soul God over our body? Is God our Saviour, or are we God's Saviour? And again, there's more on this subject in my second book. Let's go back and take a look at how DNA is made up, at least in terms of its physical structure. We're told it's made up of two strands of code that twist around each other, known as double helix. If we look at the cross-section of DNA, we might recognize it as a somatic pattern. Somatic patterns are representative of the vibrations of sound frequencies, which might go some way to explain why certain frequencies help us to relax, get excited, distress us, or even heal us. The double helix is also the path of a magnetic field. In a small magnet, we see an infinite loop of the field, and if we trace the path, we get the symbol for infinity, and not just what we have been told the field looks like when we sprinkle iron filings over a piece of paper with a magnet under it. This pattern is a two-dimensional slice of the field and does not show the flow of the force. Again, we are taught a half-truth to hide the whole truth and blindly left to think we know it all and fail to investigate further. So the reason I mention magnetic fields is because I believe it is no coincidence our DNA has the same helical form. I believe magnetism is fundamental in the formation of life. After all, none of us would be here without an attraction between our parents. Joking aside, magnetism has, I believe, given us an amazing world and is responsible for far more than you may realize, some of which I will be looking at before the end of this presentation, but there are many things that are covered in my second book. But let's consider some of the biggest influences in our modern day life that are reliant upon magnets. One of the biggest yet generally unseen products of magnetism is electricity. If we put an electric current through a cable, we generate a magnetic field that spirals around the length of the cable, not dissimilar to a double helix DNA. Making a coil of charged cable gives us an electromagnet as we form a stronger toroidal field. And if we pass a magnet around a cable of coil or move the cable through a magnetic field, we can cause an electrical charge to be generated within the wire. We call this a dynamo, alternator, or generator. Generally, motion is involved as the wire or the wire coil needs to either pass through the magnetic field or the field needs to pass by the static wire. An electrical transformer is made of two coils wrapped around a ferrite or iron core, which basically means the supply current magnetizes the core, which generates an electrical charge in the second coil, increasing or decreasing the number of windings on either the input coil or the output coil steps the power up or down, and the transformer is required to have an alternating current on the input, otherwise we do not get a change in the magnetic field around the second coil. And if we pass a magnet around a charge cable or coil, we can create movement as the two magnetic fields either attract or repel each other, which is the basic principle of an electric motor. Most recorded sound is converted to electrical impulse by vibrating a coil in a magnetic field, just like a generator, then reproduced by passing the same impulses through a coil in a magnetic field, like a motor, and amplifying the vibration, which we then hear as the vibrations radiate in the air around us. Atoms are made up of positively charged nucleus and a negatively charged electrons. Electrons, we are told, transport electrical current in cables. However, if we keep moving electrons along a wire, couldn't we be then altering the wire at a subatomic level? Or did we suddenly invent free radical electrons to explain electricity when we should have been looking at magnetism to explain how electricity works and travels down a wire? Magnetism certainly has some extraordinary properties that electricity cannot compete with. Electricity requires a conductor and can be isolated or insulated, whereas magnetism does not require a conductor and can pass through objects without apparently affecting them, although in some cases it does affect them, and especially in strong magnetic fields. But even static electricity that can pass without a conduit can be insulated against. I know many people are looking into free energy, and as I think about all I have said up until this point, I can't help but wonder why water was pumped along canals between star forts, and there is plenty of evidence to suggest this happened, and there is evidence of many saltwater canals in Scotland and many star forts. Water can conduct electricity, but salt water appears to be 100 times better at conducting electricity, and fresh water can retain a magnetic field, but salt water has a far weaker magnetic field or ability to hold a magnetic field, which means fresh water and salt water have some interesting properties that could be utilized in the production of electricity and motion, similar to how coils and wires might generate electricity in alternating magnetic fields or motion with alternate electrical currents passed through it. Salt water will become turbulent when a strong magnetic field is introduced, but further investigation and some creative thinking may be required to utilize these properties. Although it turns out I'm not the first to suggest these, and there is in fact a large number of people looking into this and following the works of Victor Schauberger, whom I had never heard of until after writing the previous couple of paragraphs. Just a quick observation here with regards to free energy from the ether and why we don't currently have it. Assuming we could simply pluck the energy out of the atmosphere and the likes of Rockefeller wanted us to use his fuel rather than obtain energy for free, then a lightning conductor fitted to any building tall enough or previously used to obtain free energy could potentially suck the free energy out of the atmosphere and earth it. It is said the sparks that caused the Hindenburg to explode was caused by static or atmospheric discharge that had accumulated during its flight. During air-sea rescues, when the member of the crew is lowered on the winch, his jumpsuit has copper strands through it to stop the discharge from injuring him or causing a stroke. The crew member is often dipped in the water prior to making contact with the person they're rescuing to stop injury to that person too. Generally, aircraft are earthed after landing to reduce igniting fuel. So it appears the free energy is still there, just not as accessible to the public as it once was.